I hear people say that we're going back in time, that we're going back to the era of the 1960s. Is that true, or is that being overstated?
It's interesting. Everybody has their metaphor for the way, history proceeds, right? And so I think we now understand that as uplifting as it sounds, that King's idea that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, and it doesn't always seem to be the case. Definitely, we now know that there have been repeated periods of what looked like progress in terms of racial justice that have been followed by fierce backlash. We saw that in Reconstruction, followed by Jim Crow. We saw it in the 60s, as I say, in one year, in 1966. As soon as the Black Power generation comes along and says, we're going to push things a little bit further than the King generation did, you see this fierce political backlash and violent backlash in the streets of Chicago when King comes to Chicago talking about housing. And I think you see it now. 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, people in the wake of the George Floyd's murder and all of these historic protests, unprecedented in terms of numbers, interracial protests in support of racial justice around the country and around the world. Where are we now? Ron DeSantis is trying to ban the study of Black studies in Florida. Books are being banned. There's more action in terms of voter suppression than there's been in a long time. That doesn't mean that progress doesn't happen. It just means that it is almost inevitable, at least in terms of the story of race in our country, that every time you have a major period of progress, you're going to see the backlash too, and you got to be ready for it. I mean, that's another lesson, I think, for activists today.
I want to talk about you for a minute and media. You have a iconic history. You were the first black man to lead a national news magazine. That was, of course, Newsweek from 98 to 2006. Uh, what is the role of media here? I mean, well, there's obviously a huge role. I just feel like, as somebody who's worked in media for a long time, it's just gotten so salacious and it's gotten so. And listen, let me say this: you may disagree. I don't think we were ever really we were ever really objective. I mean, I've been covering lynchings every single day this month, and you'll see the news reports from the New York Times on lynchings, the lies they were putting out there. So I
Yeah.
kind of feel like it's a bit of BS that we used to be so objective. I don't really know about that, but something, maybe it's social media, maybe it's the internet, but something feels a little bit more dangerous and scary now. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I do think you can. There are a lot of reasons why I think some of the things that were bad have gotten worse. But let me just tell you one little story from the book, which shows you that this is not new. So Stokely Carmichael unleashes this slogan, Black Power, in a nighttime rally in the middle, in like deep rural Mississippi, in the middle of the Meredith March in 1966. The only story about it the next day is a small Associated Press story, but it gets picked up by over 200 newspapers the next day, a Friday. And by Sunday, he's booked on Face the Nation for his first national TV appearance. And from the get-go, they are pressing him, the white journalist panel that hosted that show, about, what do you mean by Black Power? Is this armed revolution? Are you rejecting everything that Dr. King has stood for? Anyway, I interviewed one of the journalists who was a guy named Jim Doyle, who was reporting for the Washington Post, who was on that panel, on that show in 1966. And he said, well, we understood that our job on those Sunday shows was to get a headline for the Monday newspapers. So we were essentially trying to pick a fight, get Stokely Carmichael to pick a fight with Dr. King on air. Right? So this
Viral
is like
clip
people
of the
talk
day.
about Face the Nation, Meet the Press as though these were the gold standard. Look, they were doing it even then. and they weren't even doing it for partisan reasons. They were just doing it for ratings and for attention. But look, the media, you may not like it, but the media and the way the media covers these justice movements, it's part of the story. And the way those movements respond to the media coverage is also part of the story. And I think that's become more and more the case. You cannot take the media out of the history.
One more question before you go. Were you with Newsweek when the Monica Lewinsky story broke?
I was.
Didn't Newsweek break that story first?
Yeah, we had the story. Michael Isikoff,
And you held it.
great investigative reporter, basically had the story. He almost had too much of the story, and we were still working on kind of putting it all together when we got scooped, at least on some of it, by other publications. And then once we published everything we knew, it became clear that we had a lot more than everybody else, and we ended up winning a national magazine award for our reporting. And
Yes.
yeah, so we were definitely in the middle of all that.
Can you imagine if that would have happened in the era of social media? I mean, you guys were taking your time. Folks would have been rushing. Can you imagine if such an? I mean, I know
No,
people
yeah,
think
yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
salacious, but
Yeah,
to
no, and
take
it's
a
look, I mean,
tweet.
this is a larger issue, but it just means that the rules. I mean, I still think that the sort of responsible journalists and responsible journalistic institutions still need to should be trying to make sure that they really know what they're talking about and they have their facts straight and they've done the reporting. But as you point out, like, everything moves at warp speed. And it's really hard. That's that that's you're not going to put that genie back in the bottle. So you got to do, you got to do what you think is the right thing to do journalistically, but with the understanding that there is this thing that's going on around you that isn't always based on people knowing what they're actually talking about.
Are you optimistic about the future of this country? Some people say, our democracy is at the edge. We've lost so much; it's going to be hard to get it back. Do you feel optimistic, or where are you?
Look, it's really hard. I mean, if you don't necessarily want to feel better, but to put things in perspective, just go back to the 1960s.
Hmm.
Because people talk about, oh, things have never been worse. There's attack, things have never been in race, in terms of the assault on democracy. Well, there are some things that are different now and that are more challenging, but the idea that things are worse than they were in the 60s, I mean, people were being assassinated. People were having to go into exile. People were having to go to other countries to escape, what was going on here. The FBI was all over, SNCC and then the Panthers and all these activist movements. I look. I mean, again, I think it's I talk a lot about this, but August Wilson, my man from Pittsburgh, one of his plays was called Two Trains Running, right? And, like, to me, that's American history. It's two trains running, particularly when it comes to race. Like, there's a good train, there's the bad train, and they're both running all the time. Doesn't mean that there isn't progress. That's one train, but there's the backlash and the resistance. That's another train, and sometimes one pulls ahead, and sometimes the other pulls ahead. But they're always running. So it's not this thing of, like, we go two steps forward and one step back, necessarily, or one step forward and two steps back. It's like those two trains, they're the two tracks, and they're right next to each other, and they just keep competing for which one is going to be in front of the other at any given time.